when my husband, Dan, dropped an unexpected bombshell that altered the fabric of our routine. He had received an invitation for a week-long business trip overseas. As the words tumbled from his lips, my heart tightened. I knew this was part of his job, a responsibility he had always embraced with enthusiasm. Yet the idea of being alone in our house for an entire week after so many years together felt daunting and unsettling. Dan busily packed his bags, carefully folding his clothes and arranging his travel essentials with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. As he zipped up his suitcase, he turned to me, his eyes bright with anticipation. "I'll miss you, but I'll check in every night, okay?" he promised, leaning down to plant a quick kiss on my forehead. His cheerful demeanor did little to quell my rising anxiety. As he stepped out the door, the weight of the impending solitude pressed heavily on my chest. With Dan gone, the house suddenly felt enormous and overwhelmingly silent. The familiar sounds of our everyday life, the laughter, the shared moments, had vanished, leaving behind a stark emptiness that echoed in the corners of our home. I wandered through the rooms, feeling the absence of his presence in every space. The first couple of days passed without much trouble. I tried to establish a routine to fill the void. I worked from home, immersing myself in projects and deadlines to distract myself. In the evenings, I turned to television, finding solace in familiar shows that momentarily transported me away from my solitude. I also took long walks around the neighborhood, breathing in the crisp autumn air, hoping the physical activity would shake off my feelings of isolation. However, on the third day, everything changed. That evening, I settled into the couch, wrapping my fingers around a steaming cup of tea, trying to relax as I flipped through the channels. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, jolting me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a rush of curiosity mixed with a hint of apprehension surged through me. As I opened the door, I was surprised to find Mark standing there, Dan's best friend. He greeted me with a warm smile, his easy charm lighting up his face. In his hand, he held a bottle of wine, the label glinting in the soft light of the porch. "Hey, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you," he said casually, tilting the bottle slightly as if to emphasize his thoughtful gesture. "I know Dan's away, and it must be a bit lonely." Mark and Dan had been inseparable since college. Their friendship built on years of shared experiences and inside jokes. They shared an easy rapport that had stood the test of time. Although we occasionally hung out together, I had never had the chance to spend time alone with Mark. He was usually around Dan, always present but never truly engaged with me. "Oh, thanks. You didn't have to do that," I replied, stepping aside to let him in, my mind racing with unexpected emotions. He shrugged, a laid-back smile on his lips. "Just being a good friend." At that moment, I dismissed any feelings of unease. Mark felt like family, someone I could trust. We settled into the living room, glasses clinking as we poured ourselves wine, and began to talk about the usual topics: work, mutual friends, and how Dan was adjusting to the trip. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as if we had been chatting like this for years. I found myself laughing more than I had in days, and it was a refreshing sensation. Mark had always been charming, but tonight, I noticed a genuine kindness and humor in him that I had previously overlooked. I felt a sense of ease in his presence, a comfort that enveloped me like a warm blanket. Before I knew it, 2 hours had slipped away, and we were still deep in conversation, exploring topics that felt surprisingly intimate for a friendship that had mostly been on the periphery of my life. As the evening wore on, I caught Mark looking at me with an intensity that made my heart race. His gaze held a depth I hadn't seen before. It was neither inappropriate nor uncomfortable, but it felt different, charged with an energy that left me feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. There was a fleeting moment when the air between us shifted, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken. I felt it, but neither of us named it aloud. I quickly brushed it off, convinced it was just my imagination. After all, he was Dan's best friend, and I was Dan's wife. There was no way Mark would ever cross that line, right? Sensing that the night had gone on long enough, I changed the subject and decided it was time to say goodnight. I think I should get to bed, I said, hoping to dispel the strange tension lingering in the room. He smiled and thanked me for the company, his eyes still holding that unsettling intensity as he turned to leave. As I closed the door behind him, the weight of the moment settled on my shoulders, and I couldn't shake the odd feeling that hung in the air. This was not how things were supposed to be. The next morning, I woke up feeling slightly off. My thoughts drifted back to the previous evening, replaying the conversation with Mark in my mind more than I cared to admit. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of having company during a vulnerable time with Dan away. Yet, a nagging voice in my head kept revisiting the subtle shift in our interaction. I busied myself with work, trying to shake off the thoughts, but they crept in at unexpected moments. When I was making coffee, when I glanced at the couch where we had shared laughter just a few hours prior. What bothered me most was a realization that I was thinking about Mark at all. He had been a familiar presence in my life for years, but suddenly, I found myself noticing him in a different light. He was just a friendly face before. Now, he felt like something more complicated and intriguing. By the afternoon, I could no longer resist the urge to confide in someone. I picked up my phone and called my friend Lily, knowing she would listen without judgment. So, Mark came by last night. I started, trying to keep my tone casual. Mark, Dan's friend, Lily asked. Her curiosity piqued immediately. Yeah, he just wanted to check in on me, I guess. We had a few glasses of wine and talked. It was nice, I said, but hesitation crept into my voice as I recalled the intensity of our conversation. And, she pressed, her interest clear. I sighed, feeling the weight of my thoughts. I don't know. There was this moment. I can't explain it. It wasn't anything specific, but it felt like something. Lily paused for a beat, contemplating my words. What did he do exactly? Nothing, I quickly replied, a sense of urgency in my voice. That's the thing, it wasn't anything tangible. It was more like a feeling, an awareness that we were both acutely aware of something we weren't supposed to be aware of. Lily hummed thoughtfully, processing my words. Well, that's tricky. I mean, he's Dan's best friend. Maybe it was just the wine talking. Maybe. I replied, though deep down, I wasn't entirely convinced. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on anything but that conversation, but Mark seemed to occupy every corner of my mind. It was absurd. He had just been a good friend, and here I was, overthinking every interaction because I was lonely. That evening, as I sat down for dinner alone, my phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Mark. Asterisk had a great time last night. Hope I didn't overstay my welcome. Asterisk. I stared at the message, my heart racing as I considered my response. I typed out a few different replies, each one feeling too heavy with meaning, before settling on a simple asterisk, not at all. It was nice to have company. Asterisk. A few minutes later, his reply came through. Asterisk, glad to hear that. I was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow if you're free. No pressure, of course. Asterisk. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid whatever this was from turning into something more complicated. Yet, the other part of me, the part that had been lonely and bored for days, was tempted by the idea of his visit. It wasn't like anything would happen, I told myself. It was just another visit from a friend. Sure, tomorrow works, I replied before I could overthink it. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. I couldn't stop questioning myself. Was I setting myself up for something I couldn't control, or was this all in my head? When evening arrived, Mark knocked on the door again, this time bringing takeout in hand. Hope you're hungry, he said with a playful grin. We settled at the kitchen table, eating and talking like we had the other night, but this time the energy between us felt even more charged. Every laugh, every glance felt heavier, as though we were skirting around something unspoken, a boundary that both excited and terrified me. At one point, I caught him staring at me a little longer than usual, and my heart skipped a beat. I quickly looked away, feeling the weight of guilt settle in my stomach. This was ridiculous. I reminded myself, he's Dan's friend. Nothing is going to happen between us. Despite my best efforts to push it aside, an undeniable pull towards the idea of letting something happen between Mark and me lingered in my mind, filling me with an unsettling mix of exhilaration and dread. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension, remnants of the previous night's conversation still hanging in the air. We'd dance around our feelings with small talk and casual banter. But beneath our playful exchanges, the electric charge between us simmered, waiting for a spark. Suddenly, without fully considering the consequences, I found myself asking a question that had been plaguing my thoughts. Mark, do you ever wonder what would happen if we weren't tied to other people? The moment the words escaped my lips, I felt a rush of vulnerability wash over me. He looked at me, surprise flickering in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something deeper, more contemplative. After a pause that felt like an eternity, he responded, his voice low and thoughtful. I've thought about it more than I should. His admission sent my heart racing. A mix of excitement and panic surged through me, igniting a firestorm of emotions I had tried to suppress. I'm sorry, I stammered, flustered by my own boldness. I don't know why I said that. Mark shook his head, his expression softening, but carrying an unmistakable weight. No, don't apologize. I've been feeling something too, but I don't want to ruin anything between you and Dan. That's sacred. His words hit me like a physical blow, the reality of our situation sinking in. In that moment, I understood just how close we were to crossing a line that could irrevocably change everything. I nodded, feeling the gravity of our exchange. Yeah, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I love Dan. Mark leaned back, releasing a deep breath as if he were shedding a heavy burden. I know, and I respect that, he said. But it's hard being around you sometimes. There's this connection that I can't ignore. Silence enveloped us, each lost in our thoughts as the weight of our acknowledgement settled heavily in the room. We had unearthed a truth neither of us wanted to confront, and now there was no turning back. When Mark finally stood to leave, he cast one last lingering glance at me. I should go before we make a mistake. I nodded, words escaping me, and watched him walk out the door, the emptiness of the house settling in around me. I was left to confront the complicated mess of emotions swirling inside my mind, a tumult of guilt, desire, and fear. The following morning, I awoke with a strange combination of relief and dread coursing through me. Part of me was grateful that we had managed to hold back, but another part couldn't stop replaying our conversation, haunted by the near miss of something that could shatter my marriage. Later that day, Dan called, his voice warm and familiar, yet I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me from within. As he talked about his meetings and colleagues, expressing how much he missed me, each word felt like an added weight pressing down on my chest. I responded automatically, striving to sound upbeat and normal. But inside, I felt as though I were living in two conflicting realities. One where I was Dan's devoted wife, and another where Mark had stirred feelings I wasn't ready to confront. Later that evening, I resolved to call Mark, wanting to ensure everything was normal between us. I didn't want to risk any awkwardness after our previous conversation. Hey, I said when he answered, trying to sound casual. I just wanted to check in and make sure we're okay after last night. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and my heart raced. Yeah, we're fine, he finally replied, but the usual ease in his tone was noticeably absent. Are you sure? I really don't want things to be weird between us. I pressed, feeling the tension spiral. Mark sighed softly, the sound heavy with concern. Look, it's not weird, but we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's dangerous for both of us. I knew he was right. I agree. I don't want to mess things up, I said, my voice firm. Neither do I, he replied, his honesty catching me off guard. But it's hard, you know? I've been thinking about you a lot more than I should, and I know that's wrong. Dan's my best friend, and you're his wife. Hearing him admit this out loud made everything feel more real, and for a moment, I was at a loss for words. We both recognized the gravity of our feelings, yet we had to find a way to navigate this precarious situation. We have to stop this, Mark. I finally declared, my resolve hardening. Whatever this is, it can't go any further. I love Dan, and I can't hurt him like that. Mark's voice softened, revealing the depth of his struggle. I know. I get it. I don't want to hurt him either. A long silence stretched between us, the weight of our emotions filling the space where words failed. We both felt the pull of something more, the temptation to give in to our desires. But I knew that crossing that line would lead to irreparable damage. I can't, I whispered, more to myself than to him, feeling the depth of my conflict. Mark stood up, running a hand through his hair, visibly torn. I know I should go, he said, but neither of us moved, both frozen at the edge of a decision we were afraid to make. Finally, Mark turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he looked back at me, his gaze filled with sincerity. For what it's worth, I care about you, but I won't be the one to ruin your marriage. With those words, he stepped out of my life, leaving me with a conflicting mix of relief and sadness. I had made the right choice, yet it felt anything but victorious. It felt as if I had lost something significant, something I hadn't even realized I wanted. The next day, Dan returned home. His warm embrace was familiar and comforting, yet a distance settled within me that I couldn't articulate. I laughed at his stories and fell back into the rhythm of our life together, but I felt a profound shift underneath the surface. Mark and I didn't speak again after that night. We silently agreed to let the tension fade into the background, and it was easier that way, safer. As time passed, the intensity of our shared moment dissolved into memory, but it left an indelible mark. Neither of us would ever admit to it, but I knew that even the strongest boundaries could bend under the weight of unspoken feelings. Although I never crossed that line, I was acutely aware of how dangerously close I had come, and it filled me with a lingering sense of loss that I couldn't shake.